Prologue. The Plague of Athens. Like all epidemic diseases, the Plague of Athens struck suddenly and without warning. It happened early in the summer of 430 BC, when the city was crowded with refugees from the countryside. Athens had been at war for almost a year with the neighboring Greek city-state of Sparta, and the refugees had fled to the city to escape the fighting. Surrounded by mountains and protected by strong fortifications, Athens seemed to be a safe haven. Then the disease came, not by land, but by sea. It is thought that infected sailors on a ship from Egypt brought the mysterious illness to Greece. The first cases were reported in Piraeus, the port that served Athens, and from there it quickly spread to the larger city. Within days, hundreds of people fell ill. The first symptoms were a severe headache and redness of the eyes. These were followed by inflammations of the tongue, hoarseness, and a hacking cough. Then came severe intestinal upsets, including vomiting and acute diarrhea. Temperatures rose, and at the fever's height, the body broke out all over in reddish spots. In the disease's later stages, its victims often sank into a delirium. Those who perished usually died between 7 and 9 days after the appearance of the first symptoms. Greek physicians had never seen anything like this disease, and they did not know how to treat it. Consequently, the death rate was extremely high. Although no complete records exist, historians estimate that thousands of people, at least a third of the population, died in Athens during the 6 months the epidemic raged. Making matters worse were the living conditions of the refugees. Because there were no houses for them, many had sought shelter in makeshift huts. There the bodies of the dying lay heaped on top of one another, and half-dead creatures could be seen staggering about in the streets. So wrote the Greek historian Thucydides. Those who survived the disease were often left with terrible scars. Some lost their eyesight, others even their memory. Even those who had not been infected suffered from the effects of the epidemic. With so many dead and dying, a cloud of despair and hopelessness descended on Athens. Respect for the law dwindled, and crime soared because, as Thucydides wrote, no one expected to live long enough to be brought to trial and punished. Besides its impact on the people of Athens, the plague had changed the course of history. In the fall of 430 BC, the Athenian leader Pericles, thinking the worst was over, sent his navy to capture a Spartan stronghold. But the ships had barely set sail when the disease broke out among the soldiers, and the fleet was forced to turn back. The same thing happened to a later expedition, led by Pericles himself. A fresh outbreak not only carried off many of his men, but also infected Pericles, who died shortly thereafter. Deprived of its leader and weakened by the plague, Athens struggled on, but eventually lost the war with Sparta. What was the mysterious disease that brought down the great Athenian empire? Modern medical experts can't be sure. Judging from the reported symptoms, some think it was a lethal form of scarlet fever. Others believe it may have been typhus, smallpox, or the bubonic plague. Whatever it was, it must have been a new disease to the unfortunate residents of Athens. Otherwise, it would not have mushroomed into an epidemic. All infectious diseases, diseases that can be caught, are caused by bacteria or viruses. Bacteria are tiny, one-celled organisms that can be seen only under a microscope. Viruses are even smaller. It is difficult to study them in detail, even with the most powerful electron microscopes. All viruses and many bacteria are parasites. This means they cannot survive on their own, but they need a plant or animal host in or on which they can find shelter and nourishment. There they reproduce themselves, often with great rapidity. Many kinds of bacteria are helpful, aiding in such processes as the digestion of food and the decomposition of organic wastes, the formation of soil. But other types of bacteria and many viruses are extremely destructive. They infect their hosts with diseases that may end up killing them. These dangerous bacteria and viruses enter the human body by various means. Some, like those that cause measles, mumps, the flu, tuberculosis, and smallpox travel through the air, often in droplets of moisture. They can be expelled from the nose and mouth of an infected person and inhaled by anyone who is close to that person. Other infectious diseases are spread through the unclean food and polluted water. They include cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. Still others, such as malaria, rabies, bubonic plague, and Rocky Mountain spotted fever, are transmitted by the bites of infected animals and insects. Syphilis and gonorrhea are spread by sexual contact, as are many cases of AIDS. To defend itself against these bacterial and viral enemies, the human body produces substances known as antibodies. There are thousands of different antibodies, each of them capable of weakening or destroying a particular disease-carrying bacterium or virus. The mobilization of antibodies is called the body's immune response. When the response is effective, the body repels the disease and the person recovers. Since the antibodies remain in the system for a considerable period of time afterward, it is unlikely the person will get the same disease again. He or she is said to be immune to it. Sometimes, however, the body's immune response is not strong enough to fend off the disease by itself. It needs help, and over the years, medical science has developed a tremendous number of drugs and vaccines to bolster the immune system. But there remains much about the way the human body works and the way different diseases operate that medical science still does not know. When a disease is common in a particular region, as measles, chickenpox, and mumps are in the Western Hemisphere, it is said to be an endemic to that region. New generations of children may fall victim to an endemic disease, but most adults, having survived it as children, are immune to it. Consequently, an endemic disease can usually be controlled with the aid of drugs and vaccines. An epidemic disease, on the other hand, is one that spreads rapidly among many people in a community at the same time. The worst epidemics occur when a disease, such as a new type of influenza, strikes a community that has never experienced the disease before and thus has no immunity to it. Then adults, as well as children, are affected, and the risk of acute illness or even death is much greater. Most epidemics are limited to a fairly small area, a city or a region. If an epidemic sweeps across an entire country or travels from one country to another until much of the world is affected, it becomes known as a pandemic. The outbreak of bubonic plague in the 14th century, the so-called Black Death, was a pandemic. So is AIDS today. When there is no known treatment, let alone a cure, for an epidemic disease, it is often called a plague. One of the earliest recorded examples is the Plague of Athens. The word comes from the Latin plaga, which means a blow, frequently one administered by a god. Perhaps this indicates that from the start, many people believed plagues were a form of divine punishment. Some still do. Much could be written about each from the different epidemic diseases, from tuberculosis to typhus to infantile paralysis, that have caused humankind so much suffering and loss of life. This book tells the stories of three of the most serious and damaging plagues: the Black Death, which ravaged Western Europe in the mid-1300s, smallpox, the only epidemic disease that has been wiped out completely, and AIDS, the modern plague, whose mysteries remain to be solved. All three have had disastrous impacts on the affected population and left lasting social, political, religious, and cultural consequences in their wake. As each of the diseases has run its deadly course, people have reacted in similar ways. Some reached out to aid the sufferers. Others fled in terror. Still others searched frantically for someone or something to blame. All these reactions came into play in AD 1347, when the Black Death broke out for the first time in what is today the southern Ukraine.